Before we open this album, I need you to do one thing. Subscribe and stay with me to the end, because what I found inside these pages didn't just shift how I see Victorian photography, it changed how I see stillness itself, and you'll want to witness every image as it develops. The album was small enough to carry in one hand, though the leather had gone gray with the light. Its clasp gave with a tacky sound, and a thin sigh of air exhaled from within, like breath under the door of a sealed room. Tissue interleaves whispered as I turned them, that tender onion skin crackle. The first photographs had a sheen at the dark edges, the metallic bloom they call silvering, a glassy blue-black that caught the window glare and broke it to frost. Cabinet cards slid out with the dried sound of old paper, their edges bevel-cut and gilded. On the mounts, stern serif imprints of a name I didn't yet know, C.L. Hart, Photographic Rooms, corner of Maple and 3rd, printed in a slate ink that looked more like soot. The faces stared with the severity of held breath, but I knew at once these were not the dead propped upright, because that is not how the dead were shown. Everyone likes the story. It survives because it is tidy and uncanny, that the Victorians bolted their dead upright in stands, pronged clamps digging into the scalp, eyes painted open. But it was never how it was actually done. You can lift an iron base and feel it, light as an easel, not built to hold a human carcass. Posing stands were for the living, for the twitch in a muscle, the tremble of a blink. Even in 1890, when gelatin dry plates made exposures the length of a held breath rather than a held minute, a headrest steadied a jaw against the slight that would soften a line. The dead were usually reclined, cradled in arms or arranged in beds, in the long hush between the last word and the funeral. Mourning had its costumes, crepe dulling every edge of a dress to the black of extinguished lamps, jet jewelry carved to drink the light, black-edged cards announcing the loss, and mourning had its portraits. But propping a body to sit, trussed and tied for a picture like a holiday roast, was a myth born from seeing a stand and wanting it to be more macabre than it was. A stand is a whisper behind the ear, an invisible spine for the living. What truly holds a dead body is gravity, and the people who love them. I can talk like this now because I had the camera in my hands and the light on the glass and the smell of fixer in my lungs. But at that first turning of the page, my knowing was the kind you carry like a book you have read twice. The facts stacked in me, the voice I use when I say them. It was a hard voice. I used it to impress people at parties, to correct a thing that had raced ahead of how things actually were. Look, I used to say, showing a cabinet card of a Victorian family on a painted backdrop with a pot of palms painted so convincingly you could forget the brush. See that round shape behind the boy's head? That iron prong? Posing stand. He's very much alive. You can tell because his weight is in his knees, because his hands are nervous. I had this tone I used when I said the words, gelatin dry plates, daylight skylight, rapid rectilinear, like a litany. The words comforted me. They still do. I recited them under my breath as the tissue fell away from the second photograph. A woman in deep mourning silk with a crepe veil pinned back. Her dress drank the light and held it dead. She wore a jet brooch like a small knight pinned to her throat. On the table to her right lay a wreath of immortelles, wax flowers that last forever if you never touch them. Painted behind her was a column, an urn, a glimpse of a pastoral that had never seen a real tree. She did not lean. Her hands rested on the table, and at the base of her hair, almost a suggestion, was the forked cradle of a headrest hidden by a tassel. The imprint on the card named the studio again, C.L. Hart, and a street I knew vaguely. Beside the address, a line in smaller type, Daylight Rooms, Skylight North. The third portrait slipped loose and fell to my lap. It was a child, perhaps 3 years old, head turned to show one ear like a shell, eyelashes visible as strokes. He wore a dress because boys wore dresses until they didn't, with satin ribbon at the shoulder that had been painted to a white too perfect to be real. He was unquestionably alive. There was the faint blur of breath at his nostrils, the whisper of chin down. On the back of the card someone had written in graphite that had waxed into the fibers, Freddie, aged 3 years, 1890. Above, in a hand tougher and darker, a ledger scrawl, 2 cabinets, 1 cart, sepia. The fourth image turned and turned again in my fingers. It was not damp, and yet my fingertips came away with the smell of something that was not dust. A sweet, thin tang, faint as a memory, the ghost of hypo, maybe sodium thiosulfate, which the early manuals call hyposulfite of soda, what fixes the image and dissolves what might still be undone. Or it was pyrogallic acid held in the dust of the mount, some developer dried in the wood. In the picture, a man with a mustache sat in a walnut chair, the kind with a carved back that suggested luxury, not comfort. His cheekbones were too sharp for his age. The headrest behind him was visible only in the way a shadow repeated itself. the faint double of a silhouette, a halo of stillness. He sat very straight. At his feet, something had been retouched out, a foot block that had steadied his boots, perhaps, by graphite pinpricks on the negative that now left behind a softness like fog. The floor was checkered linoleum, a studio trick to suggest marble. Everything about the light was honest. It fell from above and to the left, the way north light does, cool and constant, slanting through the diffusing muslin that framed the skylight. The hard throw of a Petzval portrait lens edged him with swiftness. A shutter had been used. By 1890 there were shutters, guillotine and roller blind, and the exposure was short enough that his pupils were not drowned to black. A note on the back, printed, read, "Negatives preserved." The address on the mount rang a small bell in some unswept corner of my head. Maple and Third was a corner I had passed, long after the name was sanded off the doors and the windows boarded and repainted with no glass beneath. I imagined the studio as a shell above the shops where nothing was, and in that instant, as if I had summoned it by naming its qualities, I remembered a door in the alley behind that building, a door that had once led to an upstairs room. I had passed it at noon with coffee and once at midnight with regret. It had breathed cold at me in winter. If the studio still existed, if the skylight had not been torn out and replaced with tar and gravel, there would be a photograph left inside. That is how I thought then. Photographs are like seeds. They linger. They wait. They can be coaxed back with developer and patience. I closed the album to be carried, not yet knowing if I meant to return it, not yet caring. The alley had the taste of old rain, the bitter thinness of it. The door was a door you have seen in a dream because every door in an alley is the same door. The padlock was newer than anything else about it, the shackle eaten a little with orange, the body stamped with a brand that pretends to be strong. I have never broken a lock. My hands are made for turning pages, but this one broke open when I lifted it and set it down as though I were placing it on a counter to pay. It broke with that strange courtesy locked things sometimes show you at the beginning because they know what they will take at the end. The stairs sighed and fret sang beneath my steps. I did not have to force the upstairs door. It swung on hinges that had been oiled by ghosts and burglar pigeons. The room tasted at once of dust and chemistry, of glass and wood. And then something more, a faint vanilla like paper baking in its own foxing, and beneath it the ferrous bite of a developer tray I could not yet see. The skylight above was intact. 4 panes, 2 cracked and taped decades ago, now the tape harder than glass. Light pooled and softened on a set of muslin curtains that hung where the diffusers had once been. Everything was covered and everything was revealed. The camera stood as sentinel, visible from the door. A wooden 10 by 12 on a column stand, brass fittings smudged a color that is not gold, not honey, but the color of a fossil pulled from a riverbed. The bellows were a maroon so dark the human eye would call them black. The lens was capped. The cap was a cuff of leather that had learned the shape of the barrel. The shutter was the crude kind you work with your hand because when exposures are a second long, you can trust a person more than you trust a spring. A pneumatic bulb dangled from a shelf, the rubber gone to ash. Behind the camera, leaning like a prayer, was the posing stand. Iron legs splayed elegantly, the central stem culminating in a forked rest meant to cradle the back of a skull so lightly that the person under it forgot it was there. It was painted to match the floor. It was meant to disappear. Next to it was its cousin, the head clamp with padded arms that curve like a gesture around a shadow. Both had bases light enough to lift. Neither could bear the dead. I reached out and touched the end of one prong. It had a seam where felt had once been. Such pragmatism is tender to me. We think of tools as brutalities. They are not. They intimate care. The backdrops were still on their rollers, painted gardens whose trees had peeled into rivers of color. One was a library with spines of books so vague they were suggestions of literacy. One was a columned porch with a balustrade where dozens of clients must have placed hands that crept into the print as a blur because a hand is the first thing to betray you when you ask it to be still. A shelf held glass plates in boxes, their corners marked 8 by 10, 5 by 7, 4 by 5 in pencil. Another shelf held developer bottles with stained labels, pyro, hydroquinone, metol. Fixer in a jar that had once been amber, now amber in its memory only. A tray. Tongs that had been painted black and chipped down to wood. A packet of gold chloride, the paper gone to brittle. A tin that would have held selenium toner. A bottle that might have been acetic acid, a vinegar note that pricked the back of my throat. A notebook lay on a stool and fell into my hand when I brushed it. Ledger paper, lines gone to the color of faded bruises. A neat column of names. Mrs. Lacey, morning dress. Child, Frederick, aged 3. Mr. Baines, business. A line that put itself beneath my eye as if it had known my eye would be there. Post, Infant, reclined. Wreath. Another, PM, Mr. Carter, coffin open, home sitting. I'm not superstitious. I am attentive. An image is a lie that carries truth. The lie is the stillness. The truth is what stillness lets you see. I stood in the center of the room and looked up through the skylight at a sky that was firmly of our hour, not of theirs, and then I turned to the camera and did the only thing I would do if the past handed me a working instrument. I set the album on the posing chair, the better to keep it in my sight and to prime the room with pages it knew. I lifted the cloth, the focusing cloth, black and odorless, heavy like a winter curtain, and slid it over my head. In the world under the cloth, the light was red and then gray and then a green that could have been the bottom of a lake. The ground glass at the back of the camera took the room and turned it upside down and reversed. The world was colder beneath the cloth. I breathed, the fabric breathed back. I moved the lens, racked the bellows. The room moved, the lines straightened, the frame took a feeling. The heart of a studio is a rectangle that stops the world and lets it pour itself into a smaller place. I had never handled this particular camera, but a camera is like a prayer. If you mean what you ask, it answers. I did not intend to expose a plate. I would never open a bottle of anything in a room that had sat like this. I meant to look and leave and come back with gloves and boxes and friendlier light. But as I lifted the cloth, something tapped the album cover, feather light. The tissue page lifted itself one corner and laid itself aside, like a hand beckoning under water. That is not a metaphor. They do it sometimes in old albums if you turn a page and the air makes a pocket. But this did not feel like accident. It felt like a very mild demand. I approached the chair. The page was open to a photograph I had not yet seen. A family dressed for mourning. The father in a suit of the kind a man hates, black upon black, no shine, a cut that punishes slouching. The mother wore grenadine crepe, bands of it trimming the cuffs and skirt. At her throat a jet pendant in a star. The eldest daughter, 12 perhaps, with a line of black ribbon in her hair that took the perfection of ribbon within photographs, that impossible crispness. The youngest, a boy of 5, not yet in breeches, held a wreath that had been dusted with chalk on the print to bring out the petals. In the middle of them, on a table draped in cloth, a framed cabinet card, a picture inside a picture. There is a term for it, a memento within a memento, a recursion that makes the dead present. The framed photograph showed the one who was absent at the time of the picture. It showed him alive and small. This was the kind of portrait the earnest liked to misname, to imagine the framed boy had been propped under iron jaws. But the family's posture told the truth. They were still as only the living can be when stillness is the price of certainty. On the floor along the baseboard, to the left beneath the mother's skirt, I saw it. The foot of the posing stand, the iron base, faint as a glyph, painted to vanish but betraying itself by reflecting more light than anything near. The stem rose beside the father's ear and did not touch him. It was not supporting his corpse. It was steadying his patience. I lifted the card. The imprint on the back was the same. There was a note in pencil. After. The album seemed to have sorted itself, because the next image I turned to was not the living in mourning but the dead in stillness. A child laid on a couch, a blanket pulled to the chest. The eyes closed. The mouth slack only a little. Flowers overfilled at the margins. Ribbon alphabet pinned into a wreath spelled a name. On the wall behind, a painted spray that had been retouched with white where a glare had fallen. No stands. No clamps. No trick. The trick had been in the quiet. The exposure could be minutes when the subject did not blink. The plate could be sensitized and carried to the address and exposed and brought back again in less time than one takes to forget the first words of a prayer. The caption on the back said only, "At the Lacey's for a clock." Back under the focusing cloth, the studio had the feeling of a place that had just been used. The chair looked sat in. The lens breath looked freshly wiped with a cuff. I thought, as I always think, that if one is to tell a story about a thing people believe wrongly, the correction must be more beautiful than the error. Otherwise you have only taken something away and given nothing. The error in this case is cruel and lurid, the dead propped like dolls. The truth is more terrible, that the living held themselves so still that they nearly weren't. The stands were not chains but compliments. They said, "We know you can do this, but we will help your head be a compass." The ghost of a stand in a picture is a reminder that being alive requires allowances. I heard a sound like a shutter being cocked. Not the crisp tick of a leaf shutter, not the slide of a guillotine, but the flex in wood when a mechanism draws itself and waits. It was a familiar sound, and in this room impossible. The roller blind shutter on the shelf had rotted its ribbons decades before. There was nothing to cock. The sound came again, brief, and then it was not a sound at all but the memory of it, the way you anticipate a thunderclap after lightning. I told myself the room had its own creaks. I told myself the sky had shifted, the tar on the roof had warmed and cooled, the frame had bowed. The camera did not care what I told myself. It had a lens cap. It had no mind for any noise made with other machinery. The album page had turned again. The tissue lifted and laid itself back. The next image found me before I found it. It was of the studio itself, as if someone had lifted the camera and turned it upon the room, a small indecency. The camera had been placed where I stood. The backdrops showed themselves. The skylight glowed. In the mirror propped against a wall, the photographer's eye appeared as a glare and then not. The posing stand was in the center of the room. The headrest blossomed at its top like a pitchfork blessed and made gentle, the prongs padded. The stand's base was painted so precisely to match the floorboards that its edges broke and vanished. The print had been spotted to remove dust. On the tabletop, a ledger lay open to the very page I had just read. I wanted to move the album off the chair. It felt exposed. The feeling was like the prick along the neck you get when you realize a window is open behind you. I picked the album up. The chair's cushion held the impression of its weight and then erased it. It is a small thing, that erasing, but it made me realize how long the weight must have sat there to make that impression enduring. Since the last time the room had known weight, it had known nothing but dust. The only way a mark could remain was if something older than dust insisted. I turned a page and found a photograph of the same family, the morning one, on a day that was not the day of their portrait. The mother's veil was down. The father's eyes had the empty shine you get when a person has cried so much that there is no water left to light. The boy had the wreath. Beside him, barely there, a headrest flirted with the edge of the frame and then, as I watched, drew itself nearer by a hair. Not moved, the thing did not move. The impression of it in the emulsion deepened. It is difficult to explain if you have not watched a latent image brought forth in a dish. First the lights and highlights appear, then the half-tones, then the shadows. Even in a dry print, in the room's indecent light, the dark metal of the headrest seemed to develop itself another degree. This is a trick of the eye. I am a believer in tricks. They tell you what you want. And yet, my breath shortened. I took out my phone to record, then remembered that a screen would salt this room like a lie and put it away. Anyway, I would have nothing to show. What moved was not the subject but my conviction. There was another photograph now, though I had not turned a page. It lay halfway from the album onto the chair, a card fallen from its slot. The mount was gray, suggesting later years. The image was of a man I recognized at once, the same as in the walnut chair. His mustache was neat, his eyes secured by a brow that protected him from intimacy. He sat again, but not in the studio. He was at home, in a chair with arms that had remembered the weight of family, a crocheted antimacassar high behind him like an altar cloth. His hands were arranged in his lap, fingers interlaced with the delicacy of a man told to fold his hands. A woman's hand entered the picture from the right, touching his wrist with a finger that had the wrong tension, as if she were bracing herself against him instead of touching him. On the table beside his chair was a framed picture of a small boy, eyes down. I realized that either the boy was Freddie and this was his father, or else they were spectral cousins. The photographer had taken the image at home. The light told me that, lateral, striped by the lace of a curtain. The exposure had been short for a home, a second or two. Gelatin dry plates allowed such visits, their speed slower than a blink but quicker than a prayer. A stand would not have come. A headrest would have been left in the studio. A hand would serve as its substitute. A page deeper, another home portrait, a white casket, small as a cradle. Flowers pulled the room into a radiance that almost convinced. Somebody had brushed the glint on the casket's handle with a dot of white. In the mirror over the mantel, a black shape was barely visible. It could have been the photographer under his cloth. Could have been a shawl hung where a shawl had always hung. Could have been me reflected back across a century if reflection were not bound to silver and time. I leaned closer. Nobody had painted eyes open on the child. The child's eyes were closed, and around them the faint bruise of death's softness. There was no stand. The only stand here was grief in its compressed posture. The camera behind me made the softest possible sound a breathing object can make if it does not have lungs. It cleared its throat the way a well might clear its throat after a stone is dropped. The leather strap of the lens cap stirred a half-inch. By itself, the strap could have shifted with my movement. Where the cap had shaded the lens for years, the brass beneath was very slightly brighter than the rest. That bright ring felt like an iris too exposed. Under the skylight everything was very steady. Dust motes hung like salt crystals, catching light and refusing to fall. The motes felt intelligent. Dust always does when it falls slowly enough. The fourth shelf from the bottom held an envelope with negatives, not glass anymore but the later flexible film, a concession to modernity from the early 20th century. I should not have opened it. I opened it. Inside were strips of negatives with that sugar glass transparency that attracts the eye like honey. I lifted one and held it to the light. The room pressed its palm to my back. The negative was of the studio, empty, filled with the indifference of furniture. On the far wall by the door, a shape was darker than it should have been. The negative is a truth teller. It makes light and dark tell the correct opposite. The shape, then, in the print would be a kind of brightness, the absence that appears as presence. I did not have a print. I had a glass plate holder after all. The dark slides were intact. So were the plates in the box, which made my rational mind irritably recalculate. Glass eats time on its own terms. Plates wrapped in black paper do not vanish because you think they should. If they were fogged, they were still something. I could set a plate in the camera, draw the dark slide, and lift the lens cap for nothing. The developer would be too old. The fixer would be poison but inert. The light would do what it always does, deposit itself in the emulsion in a way too small to name. The act would be an act of theater, not of chemistry. Even while knowing this, I slid a plate into the holder and inserted it into the back of the camera. The weight drew the camera toward its purpose like a magnet toward iron. I could almost feel the ground glass make way for glass that would hold the world differently. I set the headrest behind the chair because I knew I needed a subject, even if it would be an empty chair. The act of positioning it made it visible. The pronged fork aligned with the sewn ridge in the cushion. I felt watched. That feeling is usually just you watching yourself, a foregrounding of the parts of your body you have forgotten. But there was an angle from the far right of the room that kept itself as a pressure, a thumb pressed to my temple. I did not sit. I am not a fool in the way you need people to be to make horror work. My legs trembled in their own time. If I had sat, perhaps nothing would have come. Horror punishes vanity, not caution. But then there are times when terror and tenderness appear together, the way a new print and a new bruise share that ridiculous mauve. I wanted to give this room what it needed. I had taken its album, its air. I had claimed its accuracy. I said aloud to the empty light, "I know you didn't prop your dead. I know what that stand is for." I did not mean it to be a boast. I meant it to be an offering, an assurance that I would tell it right. The word stand stretched. I heard in it a command. Stand. The album's pages ruffled. A tissue rose, held up by the kind of current that happens in a room that has few words and wants more of them, and then laid itself down upon a pair of bright eyes in a portrait of a boy who had been ill and had not recovered. The tissue rested very gently as if it had been a veil. I sat down. The action was as simple as it sounds. My body descended. The chair met me. The cushion's horsehair remembered 1,000 strangers and admitted me as one of them. The headrest touched the hair at the back of my skull. It was nothing. It was like the knowledge that someone you love is beside you when a plane takes off, the pressure of a palm that carries no weight and yet guides everything that shakes. The forked rest was colder than anything else in the room. It had, perhaps, the temperature of iron kept out of sun. My head steadied under it. A pillar of stillness rose. It was lovely, the way sitting in a place that has been made for the body is lovely. My breath forgot to show itself and simply worked. I tucked my hands and arranged my mouth the way people do when they are about to be seen as themselves and not as the joke their face attends in all other contexts. The camera did not cock. The lens cap did not lift of its own accord. But I felt time thin the way a syrup thins over heat. I did not stay long. I know because when I stood, my legs had not gone numb. But there is a dilation in the heart when you offer yourself to a rectangle. You cease to belong entirely to yourself. That is the bargain. I made the bargain and stood and took the plate holder back from the camera. I did not carry it to the tray because I am not incapable of learning. I slid the dark slide back into place, my fingers careful, and set the holder on the shelf where it had been. It felt warmer than it should have. Not a heat. A voltage. Glass that has been asked to remember the world retains the world like static. It hums. When I returned to the chair, the album had shifted. A photograph that had not earlier been there lay face up on the cushion. The mount was the same C.L. Hart. The room in the picture was this room. The chair was present. The headrest stood in the position in which I had just placed it. There was no person in the chair. There was, behind the chair, where the headrest's prongs would have cradled a skull, a brightness out of step with the rest of the light. If you have ever looked at silvering, the bluish bloom along the edge of a dark part of an old photograph, you know how it eats at the shadow with a metallic appetite. This was that eating in reverse. A blot of paler certainty that refused the room's careful gray. The blot had the shape of a head. No features. The impression in the emulsion of the place where a person's head had been held still. That is not how light works. That is what light does when you give it a story to tell. I said, "You can lean." I don't know why I said it, except that standing is easier with permission to fail. I put my palm where a shoulder would have been, only air. The air felt colder. My fingers tingled. A pinprick sensation ran under the skin of my forearm. In the corners of my eye, a movement that would not have been recorded by any shutter. The camera shifted its weight more evenly on the stand, a courtesy the way a person squares their feet when someone else leans on them. The fabric of the backdrops altered their hang, as wind would alter them if there had been wind. There was no wind. The skylight hemorrhaged the white blue of afternoon. History is not the past. It is a lens through which you allow the past to burn a hole through you. I have said that to students who did not ask for it and did not want it. I thought it again now, as the album began to arrange its images for me with the quiet pride of an elder who has waited for someone to stop talking. The next photograph my fingers came to was of a woman alone, in half mourning now, the crepe replaced with dull black silk and a white collar that allowed a breath of return. She wore at her ear a jet earring, polished so dark it reflected the room. On her lap was a photograph of a man. In her lap, the photograph was so bright it was almost a light source. You could see the headrest in that man's portrait if you knew where to look, the faintest curve of it against the wallpaper. The myth misreads that curve as the rigging for a corpse. The truth is more tender. Someone wanted his eyes sharp. She stared past the camera into the space where the person who loves you stands. The light on her forehead was the shape of the skylight. Photographers preferred north light because it does not move as the day arcs. It gives you a longer minute. In one of her pupils there was a white fleck that could have been the reflection of the window, or someone standing where I now stood, breathing the kind of steady breath you must breathe when you press the bulb of a pneumatic shutter and count. I could hear the count. Not aloud. In the room. 1, 2, 3. Enough. That night, with the album on my table and the studio smell in my hair, I dreamed of a stand carefully walking itself across the room. That is not how stands move. They are dragged. The feet screech. In my dream, a courtesy, the iron walking on tiptoe. It approached the bed in which I was 5 years old once. It put its prongs to the back of my head and reduced the vibration of the world until I could hear what the clock thought. It did not hurt. It made everything precious. I woke with my hands folded in my lap as if I had been told to fold them. In the darkness, the curtains above my window were a bluish-lit rectangle, and their glow promised I would make good photographs tomorrow if I asked nicely. I never ask nicely. I am too busy knowing. In the morning the album had rearranged itself. I had not meant to leave it open. It lay closed, the clasp reset. When I opened it, the tissue papers fluttered to the same page. A portrait of C.L. Hart himself, if the imprint can be believed. The man in the photograph wore a suit like any other man with a studio. He let his mustache do all the talking. He had the expression of someone who resents that he must be shown to do what is already believed, and so he punishes the lens by not meeting it. Behind him, on a shelf, the bottle shapes were familiar. Pyro, hydroquinone, gold. In his fingers he held a pencil, the kind used to retouch negatives. Photographers etched crow's feet away with a needle, filled wrinkles with graphite dotting on the emulsion's reverse, then spotted the print with watercolor where dust had made pinholes. We like to pretend the past did not correct its own surface. The past invented correction. He looked at the small glass negative in his hand. The light in that negative was a triangle. The triangle was this room's skylight. And in the dull shine of his eye, you could see reflected, not the camera, not the assistant, not himself, but a headrest, indistinct but present, the prongs lifted like a gesture of blessing or refusal. I touched the paper. It was dry and cold as a grave marker in shade. I could not tell if the headrest was truly reflected there or if the eye had made its own pupils into the shape of a familiar tool. I began to write the script I thought I was going to make for you, the one where I take the album and the room and fold them into the narrative the facts demand. I would tell you about gelatin dry plates, which allowed photographers in 1890 to leave behind the dark tent, and the collodion's ether reek, which dried in seconds to a skin, which cracked into a network if you shrugged. I would tell you about those plates being sold pre-coated in 10s and 20s in cardboard boxes with corner clips, their emulsions the color of old milk. The speed of those plates was a miracle in an industrial century that had made miracles commonplace. Exposure times dropped to fractions of seconds in daylight, which is to say the length of a sharp intake of breath when you see a person for what they are. And still, you require to stand, a headrest, because the human animal cannot keep its head in one place when the eye is a moving ocean. The smallest sway softens the mouth. They are not restraints. They are agreements. The stands are the bones beneath the nerve. I would tell you about skylights that faced north to hold the indifferent day, about painted backdrops that let you bring a garden inside a city whose trees were all cut down for housings of machines, about foot blocks for short subjects to stand on, about thigh braces to help the beloved incompetent, about the photographer's trick of hiding a headrest with a tassel that looks ornate but is only an apology for iron. The myth is a gasp. The truth is a hand you can unhold. I wrote a page like that, then another, and then the studio banded itself around me and would not let me go. I went back that afternoon because I believed I was a person who could place a room into a script and then exit it. There is nothing more dangerous than thinking you know the boundaries of your own competence. The sky had gone to pearl. The studio smelled more strongly of something like sugar and something like sin, sulfur, perhaps, woken by damp. On the floor near the chair, a flower had fallen from a wreath. It had not been there. Of course it had been there. There were flowers pressed in books in this room, and they shed their petals as lazily as dust. The posy lay with its wire stem exposed. I stepped over it and bowed to the camera the way I bow to churches I don't enter. The ground glass had been dusted with a cloth. On it, faint lateral scratches suggested a refocusing line where clients had been advised to put their eyes so they would be in the plane of sharpness. I drew the cloth over my head and looked. The room lifted itself onto the back of a square of ground glass and laid there, patient and sacral. It is hard to describe how intimate it is to look into a ground glass. It is like peering into someone's palm and seeing a heart beating beneath the lines. The canted light of the skylight on that glass was a hive of grain. I let my eyes slip out of focus. Sometimes, in that state, you see what you are supposed to. The headrest stood directly in the path of the lens's fall-off, so its outline was a soft interruption. It did not move. You understand that? It would matter to me to have you know that nothing moved. The deceit would be to tell you a prong telescoped out or a stand took a step. That is the theater we love. The truth is that everything tended more perfectly toward what it already was. I saw first the painted backdrop, garden gone to winter. Then the chair. Then the slight bright at head height that might have been the memory of my skull if light could remember. Then a darker smudge near the floor, the shape of a foot block which I had not seen in the room. Did a wedge of wood appear in the glass because I wanted it? Or because the room wanted to explain to me why children often appeared so solid in these photographs? A block steadies. It does not restrain. It says, put your weight here and you will not blur. I lifted the cloth. There was a block a foot ahead of me where there had been none. It looked exactly like an ordinary piece of wood. I kicked it. Was there. I set the headrest prongs at the height I preferred to think of my head as being, which is taller than I am. That made me laugh at myself, relief like a slate wiped. The laugh sounded wrong in the room. The room held laughs but not new ones. I sat. The iron touched. The camera's lens cap peeled itself a slit with the deliberation of a tongue coming off a frozen rail. It was a trick of the air. Heat changes shape. Leather moves. But the cap did not fall. The opening was a quarter-inch. The light poured in as if it had been held back for a decade and now intended to fill anything willing. I was willing. I had made myself into an aperture. My hands did not sweat. I could hear the hiss the room made when I was precisely where it needed me. It is the same hiss you hear when archival paper slips into a sleeve of exactly its size. It is the sound a studio makes when it closes around a subject like an eye being sure of itself. Somewhere across time, a photographer's finger pressed a bulb and counted. 1, 2, 3. The cap settled, the slit gone. Technically, no picture had been made. Practically, I had been fixed. It matters that you understand the dead were usually reclined. The examples are plentiful and tender. Babies shown asleep on pillows no one misread, the elderly in beds with curtains drawn and a spray of lilies at the corner of the sheet, teenagers who looked like angels because their mouths had finally stopped interrupting their bones. Occasionally, a body was seated. It is the exception, and the sitters were supported by furniture, familial arms, cradles disguised as chairs. The stands were not built to bear. They would lift from the floor like kites if you leaned. They were nods. I tell you this because I promised I would give the room my honesty. The myth wanted the dead to perform one last time. The truth is that the living performed so beautifully that even their stillness haunts. The album now insisted on a sequence. It flipped me gently to a set of images of the same corner of the studio, the chair, the headrest, the wedge of foot block. In the first there was nothing. In the second, a smudge of brightness at head height. In the third, the smudge had grown into a rounder certainty. In the fourth there was the wisp of an ear in the brightness, not an ear, I know, but the contour of a curve. I pressed the print closer. In the fifth, the brightness had dimmed slightly and taken on texture, A grain that might have been nothing more than the mottling of paper, the way albumin prints crays into craquelure if left in damp. Except this was not albumin. These were gelatin silver. The paper had a slight pebbled finish, not the high gloss of albumin's egg-white sheen. The silvering at the edges kissed 3 corners and left one untouched like a lover with a missing tooth. The ghost insisted that I use the correct names. It wanted the honor of accuracy. I belonged to it in that. It belonged to me in that. The small changes in the images were not only in the brightness at the headrest. The painted backdrop behind the chair showed a urn with a garland, and in one the garland drooped to the left and in the next it drooped right. In one the potted palm was taller by a height of a frond. In one the signature of the studio on the bottom mount had a flourish that was not elsewhere. Retouchers leave traces. Photographers get bored with how they write their own names. But this had the quality of a proof sheet where someone is trying to choose the image that best behaves. The album did not contain rejects. People do not keep the images in which they are not as handsome as they can be for the one time they can be handsomer to posterity. So who kept these? The photographer who wanted to show that something present could be coaxed? Or someone who had sat and watched themselves appear, light pouring itself into a latent self? The presence did not frighten me the way you want it to. It might frighten you, because you have not had your head gently held by iron while a stranger tells you to think about nothing for a count of 3. It made me sorrowful. It made me want to put my head very carefully into the place the headrest offered and hold my eyes open without blinking. I thought of all those who had done precisely this for the loved ones they were leaving and for the children who would one day say, "Here he is." We do not bless the living enough for staying still when asked. The dead are freed from fidgeting. The living make altitude in a room by submitting to a brief gravity. That is how we got our ancestors into the albums. That is why they look so stern. Stillness is stern work. On the floor near the shelf of chemicals, a box had slid a finger's width. Beneath it were mourning cards, black-edged, the sympathy of a town in stiff script. One read, "We regret to inform you," and then the name had been pried off with a knife to use the card again in a thrift that is wicked and also honest. Hairwork fell from one of the cards, a little woven wreath plaited from some generous head. This is what the myth overlooks, the tenderness of grief turned craft. Jet catches light in a way that says, "I do not shine, but I will give your gaze back to you a little darker, a little truer." In some photographs the heartbreak wore itself as bracelets. In others the heartbreak sat on a chair and tried not to move while a man changed plates. When the afternoon dipped into that blue that makes every old thing kind, I closed the album and spoke to the room as though it were someone whose ear I knew. I will say it right. The stand is not for the dead. It cannot hold them. It holds the smallest tremor a living jaw makes when it wants to speak in the middle of a count of 3. It holds the eyelid on its wire to be less hasty. It gives to being alive the exact amount of help being alive needs to be shared. The dead, when they are photographed, lie down. They are made beautiful because stillness makes us better to look at. There is no indignity in the truth. The myth is a wanton indignity. It is the lurid flourish of someone who has not loved enough to sit. I lifted the headrest from behind the chair and set it beside the posing stand with the casual respect of a stagehand. My hand brushed the prong. The skin at my nape felt briefly kissed by cold. I took the plate holder from the shelf, slid in a plate with that small huff of black paper that sounds exactly like a child's sigh before tears begin, and locked it into the camera. Not to expose it. To satisfy the truth of rooms. Rooms hate rehearsals without props. I did not lift the lens cap. I let the light be what it was, uncommitted. The ground glass dimmed to privacy. I took a breath that came out visible in the cool, which is to say that it must have been colder than I had realized. Then the cap lifted, just a hair, and I understood the twist the album had been turning me toward. It is a good twist. It dignifies everyone. The myth supposes we needed to force the dead upright, to disgrace them into an art. The truth is that the living are the ones arranged into an obedient stillness so that the dead can walk into the rectangular world and remain there. The headrest does not support the corpse. It steadies the doorway. The hinge of iron creates a steadiness in the place where heads vibrate the most. The photographer counts to 3 as a priest would in a different room. We hold still not so we can be seen more sharply but so that someone who is no longer here can be borne across into our image with us. I know because as I sat the last time, with the fork barely touching my skull, the brightness above the chair gathered, and when I lifted the album afterward, the photograph of the empty chair was not empty anymore. A face had not developed. It never would. But the shape of a presence at head height had coalesced to the soft certainty of a cloud you can name. When the camera returned the cap to its barrel with the quiet of a packed sealed, I felt behind my teeth the tang of hypo, as if fixing a print leaves fillings in your mouth, and my left hand, which I had not noticed gripping the arm of the chair, was cold as if someone's fingers had rested just on top of mine to be steadied. You will say, that is only a story. It is. It is a story told by Silver and by a room that wanted the correction more than I did. I left the studio with the album closed and clasped and carrying me rather than the other way, and I locked the door and put the broken lock back where it had been to behave on the outside like a decent person. At my table, I turned the pages one last time to be sure the images had settled. They had not. A photograph I did not remember having seen had slid into the final slot. It was of a woman standing, and in her left ear a jet earring so polished it offered a thumbnail reflection of a rectangle of light and what could have been a cap lifted from a lens. The wind in the image, made by a curtain that had been tugged for effect, was the only wind we allow inside a photograph like that. She looked to her left, where the person who loved her would have stood had anyone been brave enough to stand near the client chair when a plate was being asked to do its work. In the corner of the print, a faint pencil line read, "Hold for 3. Someone had begun to write seconds, and then stopped because it was a word too modern for the room to admit. At the beginning I asked you to subscribe and I meant it because this story will go on. The room will yield more and if you're with me you'll see each new image as it appears. Subscribe and come back and hold yourself still for a count of 3 with me. The dead will not care if you do. The living will. You and I will steady the hinge the right way without myth and without cruelty, until the next picture declares itself and the light does what it always does, pours itself from a skylight, touches iron and makes a doorway for someone who has learned how to be still.